Viewers of this program understand, of course, that one of the things that we have most focused on since President Trump's inauguration, and really before, because a lot of it was foreseeable, is the onslaught of attacks that are coming from Washington on the core civil liberty rights of Americans, including free speech and the right to petition the government and academic freedom. Seeming every day the Trump administration or the Congress or various officials issue some new orders, some new measures, some new laws, some new resolution, some new executive order that seems to have as its only goal. And sometimes you think that this is what American politicians do more than anything else, is to protect the people of Israel and the government of Israel, apparently by forcing Americans to give up many of their rights, of many of our most important defining rights. And we've seen that over and over in so many of the laws that we've talked about, including the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. There's a new law, though, that had not been getting much attention until today, when an excellent reporter, Matthew Petti, who's an assistant editor at Reason, wrote about them. He joins us tonight for that article, which is entitled, "Should Sharing Information About Israeli Businesses Get You 20 Years in Prison?" Sort of a headline that answers itself. He has previously reported for the BBC, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, New Lines Magazine, Responsible Statecraft, Middle East, the National Interest, and many others. He covers U.S. national security policy and his interactions with American society and domestic politics, and we'll forgive him for having worked with The Intercept because of how good this article today was. Matthew, great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on to talk to us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've been a huge fan ever since, the Snowden leaks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, let me ask you, it makes me feel a little old, but I nonetheless appreciate it. Let me ask you, as I said, we've been covering a seemingly, relentless onslaught of these kinds of measures. And honestly, even somebody who's been around for a while, I kind of can't believe, just from like a PR or perception perspective, that they're just willing, like almost seemingly every day, to unveil some policy or measure that has no real effect on the lives of American people and is really explicitly about Israel. And some of them have been quite radical, quite extremist. We've all talked about them. And so one of the things that caught my attention in what you said is that this arguably might be the most kind of extreme or dangerous type of law of this kind. I think we were talking about regulating boycott, but free speech more broadly. We haven't actually covered this. It kind of fell under the radar, but it was seemingly making its way through Congress, so I'm glad you did. Tell us about the specific background and development of this law and what specifically in it makes it so menacing.
Sure. So the U.S. has actually had anti-boycott regulations on the books since the 70s because the Carter administration, ironically enough, given where Jimmy Carter is today and on his where he was on his politics before he passed basically regulations meant to prevent American businesses from complying with foreign sanctions against a friendly country. And it was explicitly in response to the Arab League embargo against Israel. So if you're an American company doing business abroad and the government asks you to sign a paper that says, I will boycott this third country, then you are supposed to report that to the U.S. government and refuse to sign, which is already, I think, kind of a heavy-handed measure, but this is, a foreign policy measure that Europe has something similar. Ironically enough, European countries are supposed to defy U.S. sanctions on Cuba, for example. And then in the
Can I just interject there to clarify just one thing about that? So in other words, like in that case, and in the 1977 prohibition on these kinds of boycotts, it wasn't enough if you say, hey, I'm going to boycott country X. It wasn't enough to criminalize it just because, say, like some Middle East country also supported boycott X. The idea here is that what we want to avoid specifically is Americans complying with coerced or required boycotts. Like if you want to do business in Saudi Arabia, they're like, yeah, you can do business here. You just have to agree to submit to and comply with this boycott that we want to impose on an allied United States that the government itself doesn't support, right? It wasn't like someone in their own discretion or judgment joining a boycott. It was one they were forced to by some foreign government.
Yes, exactly. And you're also not supposed to snitch on business competitors to foreign governments. And, in the 2010s, you have the rise of the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement, which the BDS movement, in which Palestinians were calling for foreigners to personally boycott Israeli businesses that are seen as complicit with sort of Israeli military rule in Palestine. And then the UN in 2016 said it was actually going to come out. The UN didn't explicitly endorse a boycott, but it said it was going to come out with a list of businesses that were complicit in human rights violations against Palestinians. And then you see this mobilization by the government of Israel and its foreign supporters to, adopt the anti-boycott measures from the 70s to something that could be used against personal political boycotts or sort of like non-governmental boycotts. And in 2018, they changed it from like just a trade violation to a criminal violation to either boycott or furnish information or refuse to report a boycott request. And this latest bill would have broadened it from foreign governments to any kind of international organization like the UN or the EU, which then could arguably be used to say, well, as you said, it's not just the government of Saudi Arabia saying sign this paper. This is like the UN saying these businesses are violating human rights. And then if the business changes its behavior, the US government can come after them and say, you are criminally liable for an unauthorized boycott.
So that's what I want to actually get clarification on as well, because that's an important distinction. So aside from the 1977 law that was sort of enacted to say to Americans, we don't want you by complying with these Middle East countries who are forcing you to boycott Israel, as well as other cases as well, but that was the kind of nature of it. There was this precursor to the one now that you mentioned that came in 2018 under the first Trump administration that Congress passed that was a little bit similar in that it said, we don't want you engaging in boycotts of countries we like if there's some international body like the UN or the EU that also is supporting the boycott. And this was basically for companies, right? So like if you're doing business in the EU or the UN, we don't want you then complying with these boycotts from these other international institutions. So what are the primary changes between that 2018 law, and feel free to talk about the problems with that one if you want, but this much more extreme version that until it got a lot of attention, including from some MAGA people who raised their voices in opposition, seemed to be headed toward passage?
Well, the 2018 law actually did not. So in 2018, they attempted to pass this law that they're currently trying to pass, which brought international organizations into it. All they successfully did in 2018 was add a criminal penalty to the existing anti-boycott statute. So if you sign that piece of paper that Saudi Arabia, for example, is demanding you sign, not only can your business be fined, but you're also can be sent to jail. And again, the violations are not just if you sign the piece of paper. It's also if you furnish information on other people doing business with Israel, or if you refuse to report this demand to the U.S. government. Now, this law that was about to be voted on and sort of got frozen, that was going to add the UN and EU boycotts. And they've been trying to do this for a while. There was an Israeli government strategy memo that they had commissioned some American consultants to write in 2016 when the UN first came out with its blacklist. And the Israeli government consultants said internally, okay, the way we're going to fight this is by getting American laws changed so that the anti-boycott statute can apply to the UN. But every time they've tried to do that in Congress, the bill has died because I think a lot of members just don't want to have to publicly take a stance on that issue, and so the leadership sort of kills it. What's different now is that it's not Democratic leadership killing it; it's Republicans doing that.
And then, there's this part about the law, and I'm not sure you were talking about this part, and when you were saying snitching on businesses or telling people about these companies, but one of the parts of the law that I think is already in the 2018 law, but correct me if I'm wrong, but it's definitely in the 2025 one, is that it's not just that you're criminally barred under this pending bill if you participate in a boycott that the EU or the UN or some international group also participates in, but that you're not even allowed to, and when I say you're not allowed to, it could be a crime, publish information that would help other people boycott. So example, I'm a journalist.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm a journalist, and I want to a lot of people don't know, hey, if I'm boycotting Israel, and there's been zillions of boycotts. It's not like Israel's the first company to be boycotted. In fact, there were very powerful boycotts in the last 6 years against North Carolina and Indiana for their bathroom bill, against Georgia for their voting rights bill. I mean, obviously the big boycott movement, which the Israelis fear most, was the 1980s anti-apartheid activism that also started on college campuses. But the idea here is okay, you want to, divest from Israeli companies until they create a Palestinian state or get out of the West Bank, or you want to, avoid Israeli institutions or companies that do business. Obviously, you have to know what those companies are. Most people don't know them. And then you go to a site that is an official boycott site, or maybe reporters report on that. It seems like this law, if it becomes enacted, would actually criminalize, even if you're not participating in the boycott of Israel, if you're publishing information that encourages or enables others to do so.
So I don't know specifically whether they'd be able to enforce it against journalists, but it certainly would criminalize providing information that to be used in the UN blacklist. That's really what this law was aimed at. It's at the UN list. And again, this UN list is not, it's not the government of some country is monitoring Americans to see who does business in Israel. It's so that they can, snatch them up. It's publishing, publicly available information about what foreign companies are doing in the West Bank with Israeli settlements. And this law is, an earlier version of it specifically mentioned the UN blacklist. This 2025 version of the bill does not, but it's the exact same law. And the Israeli government strategy memo said this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it so that you cannot basically, contribute to this this list that's going around. By providing basically accurate factual information about what these companies are doing in the West Bank. That's another aspect of this I wanted to bring up is, they're not just trying to prevent boycotts of Israel, the country as a whole. They're trying to prevent specific targeted boycotts at Israeli actions in the Palestinian territories. And I think the big example of this was Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, said in, I think 2021, they said, we are going to continue doing business in Israel. We have a factory there. We're going to sell to Israeli supermarkets, but we're not going to let our distributors sell to Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories because that we disagree with. And a lot of states, because a lot of states already have their own anti-boycott statutes, basically tried to say, well, Ben & Jerry's, you are boycotting Israel, even though they went out of their way to say, we're not boycotting the state of Israel, we're boycotting a specific Israeli policy.
I want to ask you, I think a lot of people assume that all of this stuff, or most of it, has been coming in response to October 7th and the student protests that were so effectively demonized around the country, where people were protesting, obviously not Jews, but the Israeli devastation of the civilian population of Gaza that we all watch for ourselves. And the reality is way different. I mean, obviously the 2018 boycott law that you were just describing under the Trump administration preceded October 7th by 5 or 6 years. But beyond that, there's this, and I've done a lot of reporting on this, it frustrates me because no matter how much you talk about it, people still don't realize it. I think it's now up to 37 states, but 34, something in that vicinity, that have a law that they enacted that say if you want to have a contract with the state, you're a private citizen, and let's say you're a freelance educator who helps kids with a certain learning disability, but you're not a full-time employee, maybe a small construction company that gets hired by the city or the county to do some reforms on buildings or whatever, it is a requirement of that contract that before it can be approved, you have to sign a loyalty pledge saying that you will not support or participate in a boycott of Israel. You're allowed to support a boycott of literally any other country in the world, including the United States. You can support a boycott of other American states. Because like I said, for a long time now, what Israel has feared the most is the possibility of a growing boycott movement against Israel, because that's what took down South Africa. They succeeded in getting the EU to adopt laws saying an advocacy of a boycott of Israel by definition is anti-Semitic and therefore illegal or even criminal in many EU states. What do you who is behind this new law, and like out of what sort of cultural assumptions is it emerging?
So the sponsors of the law were Mike Lawler and Josh Gottheimer. And Gottheimer is my member of Congress, so I've written extensively. I don't know if it's verboten to refer to my Intercept work here, but I've written.
No, I already said I forgive you for that. And I did a little of my own as well, so I'm not on very solid ground criticizing you for that.
Well, look, there was an article I wrote last year about Josh Gottheimer's war with local high school protesters that I think is worth reading, first of all, because it goes way beyond college campuses. It's against minor children, which is kind of strange. Also, because it's just worth reading because there's a lot of weird characters involved. It's fun. But third of all, I think it does illustrate how a lot of this stuff works. Where Teaneck, New Jersey is a town with a big... It has a lot of divides, but it has a big generational divide where the adults that run the town are very staunchly pro-Israel, and the kids at the public high school are not. And, this sort of had existed before. There were sort of conflicts about this going back to earlier rounds of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In 2021, for example, there was a big controversy in the town. But October 7th, I think, in Teaneck, New Jersey, and across the world, turbocharged a lot of these pre-existing dynamics. So you have this big open generational conflict where the adults are suddenly shocked that the kids don't agree with their view on things. And at first you have this sort of angry mob reaction by people who are just like, shut up, kids, which then sort of turns into a more organized counter campaign, which then sort of activates these levers of government, or it activates organizations that know how to pull the levers of government. And so suddenly you have Gottheimer basically pushing the Department of Education to bring in a Title VI investigation that's a ethnic discrimination against the high school for allowing this protest. And I think, if you sort of ask who is behind it, I mean, there is an organized pro-Israel movement in the U.S. that has been organizing for a pretty long time against the possibility of a boycott movement, and has been learning pretty well, like, what the different levers of power you can pull are, what are the sort of anti-discrimination laws and anti-boycott laws and counterterrorism laws that you can use to sort of draw guilt by association. And it's sort of, I haven't been the most immersed in this. There are other journalists who have covered this a lot better than I have, but I do think that there is a sort of organized campaign, and some of it does come from people who are in touch with the Israeli government. There's a great documentary called The Lobby that was put out by Al Jazeera in, I think, 2018. And Gottheimer actually was one of the people who tried to get it suppressed. He personally led a sort of letter along with Lee Zeldin to shut this, to punish Al Jazeera, basically. And it demonstrates, you have like think tanks and political advocacy organizations talking to, Israeli government ministries about, well, what is the, what do you guys consider threatening? Let's figure out how we can massage the American political system. And you say cultural assumptions. I think that's a good way of putting it. I think a lot of Americans assume that sort of like the Israel lobby rules by fear or greed or something. And I do think that there is like an element of carrot and stick, but a lot of it works because American politicians of the older generation generally they like Israel on an emotional level. Joe Biden really believes that the U.S. has a duty to protect the Jewish state. And so they're willing to hear it, and they're willing to sort of do these things. And I think only now that it's sort of become a crisis and the question's been forced on Americans of the younger generation, that it's become apparent that a lot of these measures that they've done in favor of Israel are both exceptional and not necessarily popular, and actually sort of come off as repressive and heavy-handed. I don't think the older people see it this way. I think they see it as oh, well, of course we love Israel. Yeah, of course we'll do this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you see public opinion polls over the last 3 to 6 months, and they show an absolutely vivid, undeniable, I don't want to say collapse, maybe that's melodramatic, but serious decline in the amount of support for Israel inside the United States across almost every demographic group, including young Republicans, or using young in a very generous way, young Republicans 50 and under, a majority of them now say they disapprove of Israel. The only group that has maintained this normal, historically bipartisan level of support are basically like older Fox News watching Republicans. And that leads me to what I want to show you and ask you about, which is, for a long time now, I've been very interested in the way that the Trump campaign changed Republican politics. I had a kind of breach with a lot of my, I guess you could say, left liberal friends, or even friends on the left, friends in quotation marks, who, really just didn't want to hear about any possibility that anything good can come from the Trump movement. But it was clear to me that they were, challenging every Republican orthodoxy. I mean, Trump ran against the Jeb Bush machine, criticized Reaganomics, certainly criticized neocons and foreign intervention, was attacking the deep state. These had been long-standing left-wing views, and I saw them growing inside the right-wing populist movement. And I really thought about, I thought there was value in trying to explore that and kind of see where that might lead. The one issue where it never really happened in was Israel. Like, if you look at Trump's not just top-level cabinet appointments, but even the sub-cabinet level, with very, very, almost no exceptions, you find a lot of ideological diversity on a ton of different issues. Like right now, you have people wanting to attack Iran, other people who don't want to attack Iran. Every person, seeming like an admission price to walk through the door, was that they are fanatical supporters of Israel. And so this is like the one area where you never saw very much dissent, like Thomas Massie here, pretty much only that. And yet, when it came to this bill, as you suggested earlier, it wasn't the Democrats who stopped it. It was like major MAGA base voices, both inside elected office and outside. I just want to show our audience a few of these. And by the way, the list of co-sponsors, on the other hand, as you said, Gottmeier was one. He's a Democrat from New Jersey, like conservative Democrat, but still a Democrat. And Mike Lawler is supposedly a moderate Republican, but he's in a very difficult district to get reelected. And I guess he's made, Israel, like Richie Torres has, like his number one issue. I guess he thinks there's political benefits. He wrote this bill. Elise Stefanik, the whole normal bipartisan crowd co-sponsored it. But then you had here's Marjorie Taylor Greene, and this was today, and she said, "I will be voting no." And she's referring to kind of a graphic about this bill. She says, "It is my job to defend Americans' rights to buy or boycott whomever they choose without the government harshly fining them or imprisoning them for it. What I don't understand is why are we voting on a bill on behalf of other countries and not the president's executive orders that are for our country?" So like a very America first mentality that we've heard applied in many ways, but almost never to Israel. And here it got applied to Israel. Thomas Massie said, "I agree with Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'll be voting no on this bill as well." Charlie Kirk, a big MAGA influencer, said, quote, "Tomorrow the House will be voting on H.R. 867, a bill that will criminalize private boycotts of Israel, fines up to $1 million, and prison time up to 20 years. Bills like this only create more anti-Semitism," which I certainly agree with, "playing into growing narratives that Israel is running the U.S. government." Yeah, it's kind of becoming harder and harder to claim that that's some anti-Semitic trope when we're seeing things like this every day. In America, you are allowed to hold different views. You are allowed to disagree and protest. We've allowed far too many people who hate America move here from abroad, but the right to speak freely is the birthright of all Americans. The bill should not pass. Any Republicans that vote for this bill will expose themselves. We will be watching very closely. Those are some, those are not like throwaway, cursory, kind of ambivalent sentiments. These are people who with not a real history of ever opposing Israel. In fact, I think all of them have supported Israel in various ways over the years, who seem to have really reached a breaking point. Like, this is not common language for prominent people in the Republican Party at all who AIPAC could take out. What do you think is happening there?
Yeah, I was always more skeptical than you were about the sort of Republican foreign policy shift, not just on Israel, but the Middle East more broadly. I thought, this was sort of this war on terror mentality was very ingrained, and people would say the right things about forever wars, but not actually not want to change anything specific. So I've been actually very surprised at how rapid, and I think pleasantly surprised at how rapid the shift has been in the Republican base. I think, it's just that the question has been forced so dramatically. for a while, it seemed that the wars in the Middle East and the sort of general apparatus that the U.S. has there could be sort of political background noise, right? It's not really worth rocking the boat. There's not really anything happening there. The area is going to be miserable no matter what. And, oh, look, we have the Abraham Accords. And actually, there's sort of this mythology that people within both the, traditional neoconservative movement and the MAGA movement sold that, like, oh, everything, if we just keep our military presence there, everything will solve itself. And I think that was proven very wrong in a very dramatic way. I mean, post October 7th, the U.S. had to intervene directly on Israel's behalf in ways that it never really had to. And even though Israel's, more or less gotten what it wanted, it can do whatever it wants to Lebanese and Syrians and Palestinians, it's still pushing for a joint U.S.-Israeli war with Iran, pretty openly too, which I think would be bigger undertaking than even the Iraq War. So a lot of people who had these sort of America First beliefs in theory really, this was go time in practice to show them. And I think the first kind of conflicts between the MAGA movement and the pro-Israel movement did start with the sort of intrigue around Steve Witkoff and Mike Waltz and the possibility of war with Iran. I'm sure you've covered this on your show. And I think the boycott bill then became another very sort of now or never moment for the America Firsters, because it was just so egregious. Even though this is something that would have flown under the radar before, just the whole context of it and how much further this bill goes than other bills. The question was sort of forced, and we've discovered that actually the America First America First does mean America First to a lot of these folks.
Yeah, this is my last question, but that's such an interesting point. You were talking before about how you didn't share the same necessarily optimism about this potential within MAGA, and I certainly didn't think oh well, look, they're all saying anti-interventionism, there's going to be no war under Trump. I knew it, but it was going to be just aside from the fact that the Israel lobby is still very powerful. A lot of these people have been fed on traditional Republican politics for a long time about wars in the Middle East. I do think you're right that this idea, how quickly the Israelis are pressuring the United States to go to war with Iran, I think has galvanized a lot of the willingness to kind of speak up here. We're to the point where Marjorie Taylor Greene was talking about the prospect of war with Iran and has Charlie Kirk. But Marjorie Taylor Greene said when talking about this, she said, I'm really sick and tired of having the United States have to go and fight wars for other countries in the Middle East that have large nuclear arsenals and a sophisticated army. And it's gee, Marjorie, who might you be talking about when you say we have to fight other wars for a country with a large nuclear arsenal in the Middle East? These kind of thoughts have been pretty taboo, especially in right-wing politics mainstream right-wing politics for a long time. And you're seeing it now. On the other hand, let me just give you a counterexample. You have Governor Greg Abbott, who is the Republican two-term governor of Texas. He was one of the people who championed that bill I mentioned before that requires you to pledge that you're not going to boycott Israel. He actually issued an executive order, I think in the early to mid 2024 in response to these protests, proclaiming that he was banning anti-Semitism in Texas, which is so funny because the right has been mocking liberal politicians for thinking they can purge the society of racism through government acts, but it was basically the same thing. But there was this interesting event where this small city of the city of San Marcos in Texas had done some sort of analysis where they were able to calculate, I think based on how much the state spends and their per capita of what they pay in taxes, that $4 million of their tax money, this little small city with a lot of problems, is being sent to Israel. And so they introduced a resolution saying, we're not going to allow this $4 million to be shipped overseas to some foreign country. This is for our people and our residents and our well-being and the well-being of our community. And, representing this sort of what I think is this growing resentment at how much this is being shoved down people's throat. And Greg Abbott that day was enraged, and he issued a statement, the title of which was Anti-Israel Policies Are Anti-Texas Policies, which I'd love to hear someday someone explain. Why are why if you say you're against the Israeli war in Gaza, is that anti-Texas? But the letter was filled with threats like, how dare you, try and stop your tax money from going to Israel. And you can debate like the particulars of whether a city has the right to try and reorganize this money, whatever. I mean, there's like little technicalities there. But the spirit of this, like to be in the middle of Texas and be like, why is our tax, like, I always felt like this MAGA rhetoric was eventually on a collision course with financing Israel, with doing everything we can for Israel. I'd have a lot of MAGA people on my show during the Ukraine war, and they would say they were against it. And I would say, why? Luring them into it. And they would say, oh, we have to stop financing other countries' wars. They can take care of themselves. We have to take care of money, use this money to take care of everything in our community, including Marjorie Taylor Greene and R.K. Jr. and many others. And I would say, wow, that's really interesting. Does that same rationale apply to Israel and are sending all the money there? And they would like stutter around knowing that they couldn't answer it, but also not yet ready politically to say, yeah, Israel is included in that. And now you see that. So I wonder, from your perspective, like, have all these measures, including the ones that you so expertly analyzed and warned about today, it's like just tsunami of them, including what I just read from Greg Abbott. Do you think that they realize there is a danger that they're kind of forcing people to start asking these questions that they previously kind of hid from them? Like, God, why is it that our politicians are constantly like demanding we do things from Israel? And why are they silencing us and censoring us and sending our money over there? Like, why is it so focused and obsessive on Israel? Like, do you think that is changing the political climate some?
That Texas story, that I hadn't heard that before, and that is weird. Yeah, that's something else. No, well, look, as someone who is proudly works for Reason Magazine, I will say censorship does not work. I think that's an important bottom line, that when you try to shut up healthy discussion about a topic, that it ensures there's going to be a lot of resentment and unhealthy things coming out. I think we are for sure seeing that. I think politicians' reactions are very typical of politicians in these kinds of repressive contexts on any issue, where you see that the kids don't agree with you, and then you sort of try something very ham-handed to get them to shut up, and then you wonder, oh, why don't they like this? I think this is very common around the world, when power is threatened, to sort of reach for repressive measures and then be kind of confused when people get resentful of that. I do think that there is a sort of older and perhaps unsustainable sort of cultural reverence for Israel that is kind of unique out of all foreign policy issues. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time. And I think, again, like, I think for the older generation, this does not come off as weird. I think it comes off as like something very natural and something very near and dear to their identity. And I will add that it's, I just want to be clear, like, this is not Jewish Americans who are necessarily like this. Joe Biden was like this. Greg Abbott, who's Christian, very Christian, is like this. And
there's a big evangelical component to it for sure, and a big kind of national security component.
And I think there is also a sort of like post-World War II liberalism that does see Israel as sort of like the response to Nazism. It's like Israel's the anti-Nazism, so if you're anti-Israel, that means you're anti-Nazi. Which, of course, it's very different in the Middle East, and there's a whole other context. But the war on terror just sort of reinforced that when you had people talking about like Islamofascism.
Yeah, this attempt to always say, oh, look, your enemies are our enemies, and so you should go to war to stop our enemies because they're also your enemies. You see that now, and Netanyahu always saying, oh, you know what they chant in Iran? Death to America, death to Israel, you're the great Satan. So this attempt to kind of conflate all of this has been successful for a long time. I just really question whether it's continuing to be. And one of the worst things, if you depend on a certain belief being pervasive in the culture, it's very scary if you're, say, Israel, to watch, basically just older people who are going to be dying off in the next, few years, couple decades, whatever, and everyone who's replacing them is feeding on this steady diet of increasingly going in the opposite direction. I think that's part of why you're seeing almost like a desperate attempt to just impose these previously unthinkable measures that are designed to control the public debate in a way that they've made it almost overt, which I also agree. We just saw the liberals have that problem, like that whole censorship scheme on almost every issue caused the public to resent it and go in the other direction. And I really do think you're seeing that with Israel now. All right. Well, Matthew, it was great to have you on. I really encourage everybody to read your article because there are some, like the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is a pretty straightforward thing. You can just understand it quickly and why it's so menacing. This one's a little more complicated to understand, especially with the background, but I actually agree with you that it's even more sinister, like it's more shocking on its face, because you're talking about criminal penalties here, like felonies that could send people up to 20 years in prison, and the Congress just seemed to be like, yeah, this is a normal bill, let's be on our way to passing this. So I really want to encourage people to go to Reason and read it, and we'd love to have you back on the show. It was great speaking to you tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very glad to have been on, and I really appreciate the invite. And my family's texting me screenshots of this because they're also fans of you.
All right. Well, tell everybody I said hello. Really appreciate that. That's nice to hear. All right. Have a good evening.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Have a good one.